Welcome to Times Past, a program dedicated to preserving the thoughts and experiences of members of our community. My name is William Heitz. Today we are in the home of Major General George S. Patton at Green Meadows Farm in Hamilton, Massachusetts. Would you please tell us about your military schooling and areas of command afterwards?
Well, of course, I started out in the class of 1946, graduating from West Point in the class of 1946. Because of a basic philosophical disagreement between myself and the Department of Mathematics, I had to leave the class of 45 and rejoin the class of 46. In other words, I was turned back 1 year for problems in a very nasty subject which you may know something about called an analytic geometry.
Heard of it, I've heard of it.
After graduation, I did the usual things that people, second lieutenants do. I went to the basic infantry course at Fort Benning. I took the parachute course and the glider course. We had gliders at that time, don't have them anymore. And then in 1951 I went back to Fort Knox for the advanced class. That's for captains and junior majors. It's a pretty technical thing. Then I went to Fort Leavenworth in 57, graduating 58. And my next period of schooling was the Armed Forces Staff College at Norfolk, Virginia, and my final schooling was at the Army War College in Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, at which time I was privileged to get a master's degree from George Washington University in political science. And that's my schooling. My commands were considerable because I always sought command. I had several company jobs, 1 battalion command at Fort Hood, Texas, and of course a medium tank company during the Korean War, and the 11th Cavalry in Vietnam for 9 months, and the 2nd Armored Division, 75-77, as a Major General. Then I was Deputy Commanding General of 7th Corps in 77 to 80 when I came home and was assigned to a staff job. So those are my commands. The 2 important ones, well, there's 3 important ones: a company commander in the Korean War, regimental commander in Vietnam, and division commander at Fort Hood, Texas, in a training situation. Fairly high priority NATO reinforcing job, NATO reinforcing division.
What was your major role in the Korean conflict?
Well, I got to Korea, and I think it was February '53, and I took command of Company A, 140th Tank Battalion, 40th Infantry Division, which was operating in the central eastern front of the Korean Peninsula in the mountains. And I had 22 medium tanks under me and about 145, 150 men. And most of the time I was in support of a Korean division, which was in the line in what we call the 10th Corps sector.
This was a hot area at the time,
Fairly
wasn't
hot. It wasn't too hot until the last attack in May, June of '53, which was a real bad one.
In that,
we had to. Well, the Koreans gave up some ground. I didn't, but they did. And that's another story.
what command was most rewarding for you?
Well, there were a lot. I'm glad you asked that question. First off, I'd like to comment on the soldier in Vietnam, if I may, and I realize that wasn't in the question. But the soldier in Vietnam, for the record, and I've said this 1,000 times both publicly and privately, was the best soldier that I have ever seen in peacetime or wartime in 34 continuous years of service. That's the first point. The second point was that, to answer your question, there were certain rules of engagement, rules of hot pursuit, and certain restrictions: don't fire until you're fired upon, which were hard to handle, restrictive on combat operations, and which I am convinced caused some unnecessary American casualties. And I could give you one story on that if you wish.
Please do.
In 1968, shortly before Christmas, we had orders to work a certain part of Zone D, which was a famous Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army recreation area, in other words, staging area for attacks on Saigon. And the town that we were looking at, it really, I couldn't say it was a town, it was a one-street village, tiny village. The town name was Rang Rang, R-A-N-G, R-A-N-G. We were over that area, Rang Rang and Zone D, which is northeast of Saigon, looking for trouble, looking for enemy. And we were over it with my air cavalry troop, which had a considerable number of gunships in it and some scout ships and all. At some point in time on the particular day I mentioned, the commander of that air cavalry troop told me he had to go back to refuel, and since I was in the area and had plenty of fuel, would I take over his command until he got back? I said yes, I would. Shortly after he disappeared from the scene to go to the refueling point, I got a call from a gunship pilot saying that he was receiving fire from the street in Rang Rang. And it was just, he didn't ask for instructions, he was just passing the word that he was receiving fire. I got on the radio and told him to roll in and return the fire and see if he could neutralize any enemy threat that was in the particular area, the little village. Now this is a young 19-year-old warrant officer, and he came back and said on the radio, and I remember it so clearly, negative, negative, there are women and children in the street down there, and I would like to roll in for a closer look before I follow your orders. Which my orders were to expend rockets and minigun in the area, neutralize it. I came back and I said, Roger, go ahead and do that. Because he went down low and slow, 40 feet, maybe 40, 50 knots, and was blown out of the sky. Both he and his co-pilot were killed by a 14-year-old boy with an AK-47 rapid-firing submachine gun. My point is that this young kid knew and followed the rules of engagement. He knew them more clearly than his commander, which was me. And he followed the rules of engagement at the cost of the lives of both him and his co-pilot. That's one incident from the Vietnam War which depicts the gallantry and understanding of the people that fought it.
Then you can actually say in today our government has not done right by the Vietnam veteran.
I think they're coming around. I'm not saying the government was at fault. I'm saying the people of America were at fault. The American people were more at fault not welcoming these fine people home the way they did. Now, subsequent to my return from Vietnam, I had many, many regular Army soldiers who were all Vietnam returnees, and they were in pretty good shape. I mean, I think some of the Vietnam veteran problems have been magnified a bit too much. But I do agree that there were problems with the welcoming and the positioning in industry and so forth and so on. There were problems with that. I don't know whether you blame the government, I don't know whether you blame the American Legion or the VFW or the AMVETS or whatever, the Jewish war veterans. I don't know. I do know that they were slow in taking in the Vietnam veteran. And I believe, in fact I know, that that theory is changing for the better.
What do you consider your greatest military achievement?
I think successfully commanding the 11th Cavalry Regiment for the 9 months that I had it in Vietnam was the most rewarding, and I think I did a good job. I made some mistakes like anyone would, but I think I did a good job with that outfit. And I still belong to the association. As a matter of fact, I organized the association, and I'd like the general public to know that we haven't, well, I won't say it that way. We have assisted on a scholarship basis with money something in the neighborhood of 20 young children who were orphaned by combat action and whose fathers were served in the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment.
Certainly admirable.
We give them, I think, we have a meeting every year, and we have a committee that picks, selects the candidate. And I was at one last May, and it's a great thing that we're doing. We're putting these kids not into college. We don't have enough money to get scholarship money for a year or 2 years, but we give them a boost with a check for between $1,000 and $2,000, which helps them along. And we're doing that. That's an 11th Cavalry Association, and we meet at Fort Knox every year in May.
Is there any part of your military career that you would have changed if you had an opportunity? And what was it like working at the Pentagon?
I would have avoided the Pentagon.
Well, what was it like at the Pentagon?
Well, sir, it was pretty bad. It's long hours, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of civilian bosses that have never missed a meal or heard a hostile shot, that seem to be able to direct what we were to do. A lot of political appointees, many political appointees that were in there for perhaps for their own devices. And but I will say this, that every career soldier, sailor, or airman who wishes to proceed and be of service to his country should do a hitch in the Pentagon, because you get to learn, you have the opportunity to learn how the Department of Defense and the services work together. And I was on the Joint Chiefs of Staff circuit. In other words, preparation of Joint Chiefs of Staff papers. Some of them extremely sensitive. And I learned a great deal from my time in the Pentagon, but I really didn't like it very much because I'd prefer to be out with the troops. But on the other hand, I will say that it was an education for me, and perhaps I did a better job in units after having been in the Pentagon and undergoing that experience.
See, recently we've had a problem with, in Grenada, they said there was a conflict of command when our troops were down there. So would you think that we have to do a lot of work in that area to bring them closer together?
Oh, you always do. But I will say that for those that criticize the Grenada operation, it's hard to criticize it too much because it was fairly successful.
Well,
it didn't last very long, and it was, the planning time for it, as I understand it, was about 3 days, which is practically nothing for an operation, a joint operation of that size. So I'm sure there were some things that went wrong in Grenada. I'm sure there were some things that went wrong in World War I, World War II, and the Civil War too. I mean, you just have glitches and disconnects, as Clausewitz said, you know. Everything, even the most simple thing, I think that's one of his quotes, gets complicated in warfare. And of course, the old man Clausewitz was the fellow that wrote the Principles of War, which we still now teach, 9 of them. We teach them in our service schools. And he wrote them during the Napoleonic period, so that's a while back.
Who was the most influential person in your life that influenced your career?
Well, I've written down 5. And these are not in order. My dad, George S. Patton Jr., my mother, Beatrice Eyre Patton, whose picture hangs on the wall there, my wife, Joanne Patton, my sister, Ruth Ellen Totten, and the general who I served with and under 5 times in my career, Creighton W. Abrams. I would have to list those 5 as the most influential people in my career.
Well, what president of the United States do you consider the best commander-in-chief?
Ronald Reagan, without question. Why? He's made his mistakes too, and he's going to make some more because he's a human being. But the great contribution that Ronald Reagan has given is he's re-inoculated the American people with some red, white, and blue. And he's rejuvenated the patriotism in this country. He's made us feel proud to be Americans and to live in the greatest country in the world. And you can't take that away from him. He's done that. And because of that, and because of the need for patriotism in order to support the armed services, I got to say, as far as I'm concerned, and you're talking about his relationship with the armed services as Commander-in-Chief of the armed services, as far as I'm concerned, he ranks number 1. In my time, and I started, let's see, when I got out of West Point, Truman was president, and then, so my career went from Truman to Reagan.
Do you think it was an advantage or a disadvantage being the son of a national hero?
Neither. Neither. It didn't bother me a damn bit. And I remember getting a letter from my dad that said, he said, I realize that I've gotten some notoriety. And he said, when you go into the Army, just remember one thing, be yourself. And people who are not themselves are nobody. Don't try to copy anybody. And I didn't.
And he didn't.
No, he didn't, no. He read a lot about various leaders, and he was a particular expert on several, but I don't say that he copied them in terms of character. He copied some of their techniques. He certainly did.
Interesting. Would you please give your comments and impressions of these famous people? I'd like to start with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara.
I could have gone all day without you asking that question. He came into the military. He came into the Department of Defense as a systems analyst, kind of a guy, computer and all that kind of thing. He tried his best to do a good job for Vietnam. But in my opinion, and there are those who would disagree with me, several, he never really understood the people-sociological relationship of the Vietnam War, hearts and minds, some people call it, the press uses that term. He never really understood, nor did his staff, understand that very fluffy and very hard to get a hold of aspect of the war in Vietnam. But insofar as his efforts were concerned and trying to do a good job for the president and all, I can't fault him. I just feel he was the wrong man in the wrong job at that time. That's the way I see Robert McNamara.
How about President Nixon?
I think Richard Nixon will be treated better by history 10, 15, 20 years from now than now. I think his basic problem, and I'm getting in pretty deep water saying this, was hiring the wrong people. His immediate personal staff, I think, did him in. And of course, failing to destroy those tapes, which he really should have done, finished him. And the problem with Watergate was that Watergate was so much in the news and so much in people's minds that the conditions of Watergate took the president's mind and portions of his administration off the real problem, which was Vietnam.
Right.
In other words, his efforts and intellectual drive and all were diffused somewhat by Watergate. And I feel that that is partly the price we paid in Vietnam.
Do you feel if he had come out and told the truth to the American people right off that he would have been in a better situation than he was?
I believe so. I don't know too much about it. I've never read all that testimony and all that business that went on. I will say, in Mr. Nixon's defense, that when you're in a job like he had, and I've never been in one and never will be, but I know it's lonesome. There's no one to talk with. There's no one you can really unload to, or that you feel will not go as an undisclosed source and talk to the press 2 days later. So in those tapes, and I've heard some of them, he was unloading, just like I do sometimes when I'm totally frustrated with the bureaucracies in Boston or the bureaucracies in the Army or the Department of Defense or whatever. I unload. We all unload. And I think some of those tapes were Richard Nixon unloading. What he should have done is thrown him in the fire.
Harry Truman was right when he said the buck stops here, right?
That's right. Buck stopped there.
Tell us about General William Westmoreland.
He's a great soldier. He did his best. He had some terrible obstacles to overcome, particularly after Tet, 68. And I have every respect in the world for General Westmoreland. I helped support him as best I could during the hearings on intelligence, which took place a couple of years ago. And I have every respect in the world for him. I think he did the best job he could. And his problem is he's largely held responsible for our first strategic defeat by an eighth power nation, eighth rate nation, North Vietnam, for which we will pay, or are paying, which we will pay someday and are paying now. And that's his problem. So, but I have a lot of respect for Westy, and I've known him a long time. I know him quite well, as a matter of fact. And there's never a more honorable or conscientious general that I have known than Westmoreland.
How about General Alexander Haig?
I've known Al Haig since we were cadets. I replaced him at the Naval Academy when he had a company down there, and I went and got another company. And he's a very close friend of mine. I think he's a fine American, and I hope he throws his hat in the ring to run for the Republican ticket. If he does, I'll support him, and I've said so. But I think I think he'd make a good president. I really do. A lot of people disagree with that too. But Al Haig's all right. And you got to remember that during Watergate, he ran this country. And we didn't get on the reef, we didn't run aground, we didn't sink, but he ran it.
Kept us afloat.
As the top guy in the White House, he ran the damn country, and because nobody else was running it, and he did a pretty good job. I'm all for Al Haig. Very fond of him.
How about General Creighton Abrams?
Probably one of the greatest men I've ever known, if not the greatest. Tremendous character, homey, humble, totally humble. A wonderful, caring soldier with very, very deep emotions about soldiers. And probably, of the senior officers I've known, the most understanding one of the common soldier, the frontline doughboy or infantryman or tanker that I've ever known. And he was just an incredibly wonderful man who was a very, very close friend of mine. He was like an older brother to me. And we served together, I think 5 times. I worked for him during the Korean War too, when he was Chief of Staff of the 1st Corps over in Uijeongbu on the west side, after the war, actually. But I can't say enough about Creighton Abrams. And I was pallbearer in his funeral, and the lowest ranking pallbearer, by the way. The rest of them were mostly 4-star generals. And he taught me the basic rudiments of soldiering when I was a captain. And when I was a lieutenant. I first ran into him as a first lieutenant. He gave me my first command that amounted to anything. I'd had another one before. It was a small one. It didn't amount to much. And I just can't say enough about Abe.
To general's general?
Soldiers general, generals general, colonels general, any kind of general you want to make. I mean, he was unbelievable as a commander. And that's about it.
What good qualities do you look for when you select an employee or a subordinate?
Are you talking about military or civilian, or both?
Cover both for us, please.
I don't think there's any difference. I'd look for reliability as my first requirement. He's on time. He doesn't need a lot of supervision. He's there when you need him. That's my first requirement. And of course the others come inside of that. Honesty, integrity, essentially the Boy Scout law. But I think reliability would be my first choice, and was in the Army. Reliability, particularly on the battlefield, is what you seek. Because if you have a reliable commander or a reliable non-com or lieutenant or whatever, you have comfort, and you know that he's reliable, and you know you don't have to go check him. So you can spend your time checking on the people that are less reliable. Because there's a lot of things to check out there, where the troops have been fed, where the vehicles have been refueled and resupplied with ammunition and whatever, whether the guy is on the hill that he says he's on, because you're going to put some artillery in there and you want to be sure that he's on this, that the artillery knows precisely where he is, you know, for a lot of reasons, all of which I'm sure are clear to you. I mean, you don't want to kill him with your own artillery. So I'd say reliability is the #1 thing that I would look for.
What qualities did your father look for?
Self-confidence. And I never knew what he looked for in civilian world because I never knew him in the civilian world. But I remember he said the prime characteristic of a soldier is self-confidence, utter, complete, and bumptious, coupled with pride in the profession of arms. That's a quote.
What do you think we should teach our young people that will be involved in other countries, either by working there or they are stationed there?
Well, that's a mouthful. And I'm sure this wonderful TV station doesn't have a couple of hours to spend on some retired general who's sitting around in South Hamilton trying to grow a few blueberries. But I think there's a tremendous requirement for the young people to learn another language and to learn the culture which is associated with that language. And the languages, unfortunately, which I would highlight are Russian, Chinese, Spanish, and Arabic. Now, of those four, three of them are the most difficult languages in the world. Chinese,
Yeah, right.
Russian, and Arabic. And of those three, I think Arabic is probably the most difficult. But it is very, very important that we understand, act to understand the cultural drives, the sociological drives of a society with which we are trying to work. And you cannot do that well, really well, unless you are pretty good at reading, writing, and speaking the particular language involved with that society. Now, if there's any lesson that came out of the Vietnam War, that is the lesson that I would leave with you. That we just did not understand the various drives of the Vietnamese people, South Vietnamese people, and of course the North Vietnamese people. And we attempted, at least some did, I don't feel that I did, we attempted to put them in our own mold. Now the reason I didn't is because my first tour, I was with Special Forces and affiliated with the Central Intelligence Agency, in which I was very much tied in with the people of Vietnam, to include the Montagnard, the Aboriginal natives that live along the Laos and Cambodian border. And I think I learned the cultural aspects of Vietnam on that tour, which of course in a later tour stood me in good stead.
What ideas do you have that should be passed on to the young people of this country?
Well, of course, in my opinion, we need a new generation in politics, both state, city, national politics. And that's one thing we ought to be teaching, is the getting some of the less wholesome people out of the political system and getting some people into that system that are truly dedicated to the progress of this nation and the welfare of this nation, and not so much dedicated to themselves. The second thing we need to have a group of people better informed on the world. And like I said, I think before, we have to get more deeply into the culture and the cultural drives of other portions of the world, particularly those portions of the world that are of strategic interest to the United States, namely Russia, China, Central and Latin America, and the Middle East. Of those four, I would have to say that probably Central and Latin America has to rank number one because of its proximity to the United States in terms of geography. But also the world of Islam and the Zionist movement are extremely important, that we have a better understanding of what in the hell goes through their minds, so that we can have sufficient empathy to project ourselves mentally, if you will, into their culture and look at the world through their eyes instead of our own. That's about the best way I could explain that, off the cuff.
You once told me some interesting stories to use an example to express this. Would you tell us about the pearl necklace episode?
Oh yeah, well that was interesting. I was in Japan on R&R, Rest and Recreation, just shortly before my mother died in 1953. I guess it was August 53, from Korea. And my family had some friends there, Americans, who were working in Japan at the time, in the industrial base there, advisory people, and they invited me to dinner, and at the dinner was a very well-known Japanese lady, and I was trying to be a good conversationalist and all, and we were sitting there at dinner having tempura shrimp, which is delicious, by the way. And I happened to admire her pearl necklace, which was a Mikimoto culture pearl necklace worth maybe $5,000, $6,000, maybe $10,000. I told her that she was wearing a beautiful necklace, and I enjoyed looking at it, and she took it off and gave it to me. Well, if you can imagine, I was speechless, and I was somewhat upset. So I accepted it, and after everybody went home, I was staying at this particular house with this couple. I got a hold of the husband, and I said, "What the hell do I do now?" He said, "Very simple, very simple." He said, "What you did was cause her to give it to you because it's Japanese custom. So tomorrow morning, get in a taxi cab, go to her home, ring the doorbell, and give it back with your compliments." That's precisely what I did. And when she came to the door, and I remember she did come to the door, she was a woman about 50, I suppose, at that time. When she came to the door, she went through the motions of refusing to take it back. But I persisted, and after a couple of minutes of conversation, she regretfully took it back. But it's all custom, you understand? It's all custom, and is of great importance that we understand, we Americans understand those particular customs, of which there are many, many.
Right. She would have then lost face, and you would have been in disgrace by not returning it.
Well, I don't know if I'd been in disgrace, but it would not have been the proper thing to do to keep the necklace.
Right.
That's what my host told me.
I see.
So that's just one small example of understanding the cultural aspects of a particular society, and I did not understand them, obviously, or I wouldn't have pulled that boner.
Right. There was one other you were telling me about that was of a funny nature, that it had to do with the new buildings and the bathrooms placed
well,
in
that's
them.
written up in Harlan Cleveland's book, which we used in George Washington University. It's called The Overseas Americans. And we were studying foreign cultures at the time. And it seems that a U.S. engineer went to Iran at the request of the Iranian government and built a series of apartments for low-level workers in aircraft or whatever it is just outside of Tehran. And he was very proud of this accomplishment, and when he went back to his company in the States, he was promoted and given a pay raise. Well, somehow or another, about 3 years later, he decided to travel back and have a look at his apartment complex that he built with his wife and family. And when he got back in the area, he smelled an awful smell. So he got a little closer and he found out that nobody had been using the plumbing. Nobody. It was all spread around the apartment. Now, these are peasant Iranian people.
Right.
So he got a hold of the engineer that had helped him, you know, the Iranian engineer that had helped him put this thing together, and he said, what's the problem? And the fellow said, do you really want to know? And he said, yeah. He said, I want to know. He said, I can't stand it. He said, I go over there and we built these $1 million apartment complex, and here you are with no plumbing in use. He said, I can't stand that. He said, I'm embarrassed. He said, well, he said, what you did was you put the toilets in most of the apartments so that when they sat on them, they had their backs to Mecca. And because of that, they would not use the toilet. So he said, well, we'll go to work and turn them around somewhere or another. And he did after a year or so of work, and everybody felt fine. But nobody had told him. In other words, they were afraid to tell him when he put the toilets in, for some reason. And I guess they didn't want to lose face, or didn't want to get him shook up, or they didn't want to cause any more expense or heartburn. But that story's written up, and it's a good story. And once again, it has the lesson of cultural understanding.
An expensive lesson that was, I'm sure.
Lesson. That's right. So there you are.
Well, there are other customs in foreign lands that we wouldn't understand. You might mention in Vietnam, when you see two men holding hands, that it means something.
That does not mean that they're gay. It means that they're good friends. And that's just a custom that at least with the South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, now that they're in Ho Chi Minh City, may have changed all that. But that's the good male friends hold hands.
And which, if soldiers could misunderstand this if they were over there, not knowing the customs.
That's right. So we got to do some research and that kind of thing.
And some education.
That's right. And the schools are a good place to do it. And my whole theory is to marry the language with the cultural understanding. Now my son Ben is doing exactly that insofar as Spanish is concerned. He's going to Spain this summer and live with the Spanish and take a course in advanced Spanish and learn through association with the Spanish people how they feel and how they think and how they work and play. And I'm all for that.
Do you have any untold stories about your father that, in your opinion, historians should be aware of that you wish to correct?
No, I really don't. I can't think of any that I could correct. The latest book that came out by Blumenson, George S. Patton Jr., The Man Behind the Legend, I don't think he was as anti-Semitic as Blumenson pointed out or indicated that he was. That's one example of what I might correct, but perhaps my sister could orient you better on that than I. You see, I had very little association with my dad from 1942 to 1945 when he died. I only saw him twice. He came up to West Point to see me before he went to Africa, and I met him in Boston when he landed at Hanscom Air Force Base. Then it was had some other name, and I saw him one night here, and that's all. And when he went to Europe, I never saw him again because I did not go to Europe when he was injured. So between 1942 and 45. I saw him for a period of about 36 hours.
I see. Well, I want to thank you for inviting us into your home, and it's been a real pleasure.
Hope I've helped you in what you're trying to do, and I certainly appreciate what you're trying to do for the youth of this area. I think it's very important that they don't make the same mistakes that we did.
Right.
You know, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.